The TDN Writers Room is brought to you by The Green Group, a tax consulting and advisory firm specializing in the thoroughbred industry. For more information on The Green Group and what it can do for your taxes, go to www.greenco.com.
And we welcome in now the Green Group guest of the week. His name is David Lambert, and he is the founder of StrideSAFE USA. David, I know we'll have a lot of questions for you, but let's just start with the nuts and bolts and explain to us, what is StrideSAFE USA? How does it work? And how can racing best use the information that you provide the sport with from your product?
Oh, that's a lot. So in order, StrideSAFE USA is a company that we put together a few years ago. It's a partnership initially between myself and a man in Australia. His name's David Hawke. He owns a company called StrideMaster. Dave had a company that developed a sensor system that they used originally for timing and to provide handicapping information to people in Tasmania. I was down there in Australia in 2018 giving a lecture and had occasion to meet with Dave's wife, who's also an English vet. And we were talking about sensors because I had sensors on racehorses over here to try and predict performance. And I needed a better system, and Dave's system looked fantastic. So I was talking to her about getting access to her sensor system. And then it came out that they'd had this piece of equipment on horses in Tasmania for 9 years, and they had 35,000 runs of sensors on horses in races. And I was not aware of that. I didn't know anybody had ever done that. So I was going to use their sensor, and a few months after that, in early 19, we had all those fractures happen in California. And I knew from work I'd done with my sensor system that you could see changes in a horse's stride when something was going wrong. I'd use the system to predict performance and to tell me if a horse was likely to be a Grade 1 winner or not. And it was almost coincidental along the way that we saw these pattern changes when there was a potential injury. And so I tried to reach out to tracks and say, look, if you get this equipment from Australia, if we get access to these 35,000 records from races, and I share with you the technology I know about a racehorse stride, there's going to be some key information for you here, because for the first time, you're going to get actual biological data from the athlete itself when it's running at high speed. And that seemed to me to be the logical place to go and look to find a solution to this problem we're facing. Anyway, that didn't just pan out quite as I expected. So Dave and I formed a company, and we set off, it's nearly 5 years now, trying to develop the equipment, develop the understanding, and come up with a product that we could present to the industry to try and spot those animals that were in danger of breaking down. That's kind of it in a nutshell.
Right. So David, how does this equipment specifically spot horses that are in danger of a catastrophic injury?
Okay. First thing is the measurements it's taking. It's taking movements or forces, if you like, assessing the forces side to side, up and down, and front to back. So we're getting, in essence, in a piece of equipment, what a jockey feels. So all that movement in your legs and your shoulders and your hands, everything you feel when you're riding a horse, this sensor simply picks that up and puts numbers on it so we can quantify it. The good thing about equipment like that is it's very sensitive. So we're getting 2,400 data points every second. And then it never forgets. So it can remember any particular horse in perfect detail for infinity, for as long as you want to go. So that gives us a massively sensitive and important tool if we're starting to understand horse movement. And then we'd recognized already that every horse has his own unique way of going. These sensors would pick up the same pattern for the same horse all the time. But if something were to go wrong with that horse, then that pattern changes and the sensors are able to pick that up. And so the preliminary work was to look at cases where we knew the horses had suffered a fatal injury and try to quantify the nature of the patterns that preceded the fatality. That was the basic research that we had to tidy up. And that's where we are now. We've got that pattern. We can identify each individual horse's style. We've got an elaborate model that can tell us when the changes that are happening in a horse's body put them at greater risk of fatal injury.
So in a sense, your equipment is going to save a life. Have you had any success in that thus far with some of your tests? What about in Australia as well? And how have the trainers welcomed this into their barns? Because a lot of times horse trainers don't want to be told by a computer that their horse is wrong, when by our eye, the horse looks completely fine.
Yeah, that's right. That's the whole thing right there. There's a huge amount there. Let me start with the good news, if I can. Has it worked? Most clearly it has. We've done some retrospective studies. On one occasion, we had approximately 20 horses that subsequently died in a group of 6,600 runs. And when we did the math on all of that, we were able to identify 18 out of the 20 before the event happened. Once we had that pattern, we had an occasion recently where we had a couple of horses were given an alarm to the trainer. The trainer thought they were fine, was quite ready to run them back again. And we were able to put those two horses through a PET scan. And both of these two horses had evidence of a condylar fracture just sitting there waiting to happen. The bone was fine. All the pathology was there on the PET scan. The horse was sound, but that animal, or those two animals, one more race, two more races, they were going down. So those two animals there were certainly saved by the technology.
And what about the trainers? I mean, have you had any resistance from some trainers that are like, oh, that's all hocus pocus, I'm not believing into it, when you say, listen, this horse has to be stopped on? Yeah,
that's a big hurdle to get over. But the news is really good, because at the end of the day, all I'm doing is empowering the trainers. That's the essence of what we're all about. We believe the answer to the problem must lie in the trainers' hands, because they're the ones who are making welfare decisions on behalf of the horses. They're the only ones who can do this. So I felt our job was to give the trainers, empower the trainers, and give them the best possible information that we could. So even though our intentions were that, of course, when you show up, not everybody hears that, and they have their own knee-jerk reactions and resist and push back. And we had to face that, but that's fair enough. You could understand that, particularly in this climate. They're afraid of a new rule and a new regulation and another hoop to jump through before the horse can run a race, get scratched. So I had to just reassure everybody that that's not what we're doing. We're going to give you information several weeks before an animal is going to break his leg, and we're going to tell you that that horse is in trouble and afford you the opportunity with your vets to start looking particularly carefully at these horses. And if they do so, have then the opportunity to spot an impending problem and just not enter the horse in the race. We don't have to scratch one. Ultimately, hopefully, this will be a decision made by trainers not to enter. And even more in the future, they'll start to recognize these changes very, very early and start to get into the healing process long before anybody's even aware that something's going wrong. That's the long-term goal.
David, you said you've been doing this for 5 years. It's obviously not snake oil, and you just gave us the facts and figures and the information about how your sensors can alert trainers to the fact that their horses might be in imminent danger. So now I'm scratching my head, and maybe you have too. Why is this not more widespread usage?
I think the answer to that's probably just human nature, right? You come with any idea to a large group of people, and there are going to be those unusual folks who jump on it straight away. And then there'll be those who'll get used to it a little bit later. The establishment and the political players, if you like, the management level are going to be slower still. They have a complex responsibility to the sport at large. They must be absolutely sure that something is valid before they allow it to happen. They can't go off with a knee-jerk reaction, jumping in and causing more harm than good. And then, of course, at the other end of that, there's always the soothsayers who are just going to have no part of it. And then all of them are bound by money. They might want to do it and can't afford it. So there's the whole spectrum of things that have, I think, been in evidence as we've tried to bring this forward. But slowly but surely, we're making progress. People are getting on board. And I'm feeling pretty optimistic now that we're going to get this done.
So a couple of things, Dave. First of all, for the benefit of those people who may not know, you're not just some guy, some computer whiz that popped up out of nowhere. You were actually the one that convinced Michael Dickinson to make the move from England to the United States decades ago. You also have been on the cutting edge of technology for a long time. You used heart scans a couple of decades ago to pick out Tappet for Vern Winchell. We know how that turned out. And we spoke a few years ago, and at the time you were very frustrated because you had this technology and you knew its potential to save racehorses, and yet you were having trouble getting people to listen. What was the breakthrough moment when you very first began to get some movement in that direction? Yeah.
I think between then and now, I've grown up a bit. I was so frustrated at first because I could see this was working. I could save these horses and these jockeys, and I was a bit headstrong early on. But the reality is, everything takes time, doesn't it? You've got to get the groundwork right. You've just got to get in step, and it's never fast enough. But thankfully, we've been moving forward. I think we had a big step forward when Dr. Scott Palmer up at Belmont Park, he's the New York State Equine Medical Director and a very well-respected veterinarian. He got on board and tested our system for over a year, watched and saw what kind of results we were getting. That was a breakthrough, just purely and simply for the volume of data that we collected, and unfortunately, seeing the animals that did in fact break their legs. Because you see, you can't get a model to predict that unless you've got data on the ones that did it. Right? If you can't get the model from a sound horse, you have to get the model from the animals that die. We had the provisional model from the Tasmanian data, the 35,000. We'd investigated that and made our provisional model there. But then we had to see, would it work in this country? How would it work out here? So frustrating though it was, that year working with Dr. Palmer was very important. Breakthroughs you tend to think of as something explosive, but it wasn't like that. It was just a relentless commitment and slog towards an accurate end result. And that was a breakthrough. And then the next thing I think was academia. I got a lot more support from academia than I was getting from within the industry. But I think that's just part of the mindset, isn't it? The academics are research-based. They're looking for an answer. They're looking into the future. They're not really thinking about money at all. They're just thinking about data and solutions. And they could see very quickly that what we were doing was valid. So they got on board. Professor Bailey at Washington State University was on board very quickly. Dr. Sue Stover, I've used her as a sounding board all the way through because she's the world's best expert. She's the most well-informed of any veterinarian on the planet about these things. So every time I got something interesting, I'd run it by Sue for her opinion. So she was very helpful, just kind of steering me in the right direction. And so I was able to maintain enthusiasm as a consequence of the academic support I was getting. Because there were times it got to, we all got a bit low. We're not getting anywhere. It's costing a lot of money. We had all kinds of people here who've worked for free for 2 or 3 years. And there's a vet in Sweden, imagine, of all things, a really, really brilliant guy, Mikael Holmström. He's been working for 2 or 3 years for nothing to save American racing. A professor here in Lexington who's put in 3 years working for free to save American racing. So in our back rooms, it was a roller coaster of up and down. So all these little bits of support and this relentless move forward is what kept us going. And then there were key individuals. Jim McInvale, absolutely brilliant. He heard about this, and then within 5 minutes, he jumped. He's on board. He's that kind of a fellow. He doesn't wait. He doesn't drag his feet. He sees something that he believes in that's right, and he goes for it. And he supported a lot of this testing for over a year now. We put together a Run Happy welfare or wellness initiative to try and help his stallion and keep his name out there. But he backed us quietly in the background, when nobody else would. He helped us go. So, all these things, the breakthroughs, they're kind of an ongoing, continuing movement. It's like a ratchet just going forward rather than a breakthrough per se. We just dogged it out.
So, Dave, say I'm a trainer, which I'm not, and I'm sold on Stride Ride, and I've got a small stable of 12 horses. Can I afford it?
Yeah. So let me just back out a little notch, right? First of all, we had limited resources going in, and so the logistics of this was important. So the easiest place for us to start was at a racetrack, where all the horses are in the gate at the same time. We've got all their IDs lined up. We know how far they're going. A lot of standardizing stuff, so we can put the sensors on them, run the race. They all finish. And we've got it all together, and we can analyze a lot of horses at one go. Once you start going out to do individual horses, it gets a lot more complicated. They're coming out at different times. They're coming out from different barns. You don't know who's who. It's logistically just handling collection, identification, collection, and analysis of these single events was logistically beyond us. Technologically, it's easy. But handling the logistics of it, we couldn't do. So we had to just stay on the racetrack and with the racing where we could get all the information. As far as expense, the test cost $35. So it's a drop in the ocean compared to the value of some of these horses and the general costs of things. So we look at this as a post-race welfare analysis, that we provide that information to the trainer. The horse has run. Here's all the data, 2,400 times every second. This is how he's changed. This is the level of risk he's at, whatever it might be. We just give that to the trainer the day after every race so he can start to develop the program of care for the horse. There's a lot of interest for us to try and do it, for the 12-horse stable. And hopefully it'll get there one day. But it's rather an expensive undertaking to start doing all that. There's different requirements for the technology and things like that I'm afraid we just don't have the resources to do. So technologically it's possible, but if somebody wants to throw $1 million at us, we can get it done pretty easily. But
so
that's the kind of cost there would be.
I just have to give you $35. You come and put a sensor on my horse in a race, and then you keep the data forever. Is that it? Is that how it works?
When you say so far, the owners have not been paying for this. The places we've done it, the racetracks have paid for it and are giving that to the trainers and therefore their owners. I'm hopeful that the racetracks will see that the ones who start to do this are operating at an advantage for those owners and trainers. Hopefully it will be something that will attract trainers and their owners to those facilities that use sensors, because they're going to get this basically thrown in for being there. They're going to have a welfare analysis of their horse every time it runs. So I think if I was an owner and I'm looking at a stable of horses, I would rather go to those racetracks where that kind of care was just part of the system than I would to places that weren't doing it. But then, of course, that does create a bit of an issue, because now the racetracks are paying for all the horses. So $35 for one isn't so bad, but multiply that by 10,000, over the year, and now you've got a big number. So there's the budgetary things to consider and all of that. But it'll get sorted out eventually, I'm sure. We'll find the right way.
David, you may have changed this from reading Dan Ross's article, but when you started, it was like a traffic light, red, yellow, and green, with red being the ones that are at the highest risk. And from what I understand, this information is given to the trainers that, okay, your horse was red, quote unquote red, and you better, pay close attention to this. In a day and age when Forte is scratched before the Kentucky Derby because it looks like he has a bruised hoof, horses are put on the vets list all the time. Would you advocate that if a horse gets the red signal, they should be not able to run for some period of time?
No, that's good. That's getting ahead of itself, and we've modified it a bit since, like Randy was talking about before. Now it's a bit wound up and frustrated in the very, very early days, and I wanted a visceral response from people. I wasn't getting the reaction I wanted, and so we chose this traffic light system. Red, amber, green. Everybody knows what that means. Red, stop. Come on, guys, go on. I was trying to get everybody wound up. And that worked for a while, and it was good. It got everybody's attention. But now, in the cool, hard light of day, we realize that that's probably not the best way to do it. It's a bit too alarmist. Now, the visceral response can get out of hand and be inappropriate. So we've changed it now into an assessment of risk. And I think that's a lot more practical and a lot more sensible, and allows owners and trainers and their vets to make better decisions. So, the animals that have the worst signal, the worst data, are 300 times more likely to suffer a fatality than are the ones that get the normal signal. So we're able to quantify the amount of risk a horse is at once he's come out of a race. So the horse has run, here he is, he's back at the barn, we get the result, and that horse, the data that horse showed us in that race tells us that he's now 300 times more likely to suffer a fatality. We give that to the trainer. This isn't an absolute, he's not definitely going to do it, but he is at a seriously increased level of risk, and all we're asking the trainer to do is have a special look. Bring your vets in, because the vets know where these fractures occur, right? They're not random all over the body. There's 7 or 8 places where these things can break, and 50% of them are in the fetlocks and the sesamoids of the front legs. Half of the fractures, that's where they occur. So if you get one of these Category 5, 1 through 5 now is the risk factor, and 5 is the highest risk. So if a trainer gets a 5 warning after the race, that horse is 300 times more likely to break down, and 50% of the ones that do break down are in the front legs. So start, first of all, looking at those fetlocks and looking at those sesamoids. And in those places that have now got the PET scanner, like we have at Churchill and we have out in California, as we did with the case recently, the 2 cases recently at Churchill, they went into the PET scanner and they found the problem. So like Dan was talking in his little article last week, what did he say? It was good, wasn't it? It was screen, scan, save. I think that's what he said, right? So that's what you have to do, right? We screened them, and then the vet put the horse through the PET scanner, scanned it, and 2 horses got saved. So that's the dynamic that we're looking at. And then there'll be nuance and subtlety associated with all that. And there's going to have to be a lot of calm experience goes into it too, because the signal doesn't always come from just a horse that's going to get injured. The signal analysis, to keep it inexpensive, has to be automated. Well, automation is somewhat crude. You can't automate things, for example, like if the jockey makes a sudden pull and tries to go on the inside and bumps another horse, that's going to put a risk level 5 on that sensor, because something really bizarre happened. But clearly the horse isn't going to break a leg. Subsequently, it was an event that has to be judged by individuals, by the jockey or by the trainer. So there's some common sense has to come into this. Once this information goes to the trainer, we hope then that they'll review the race, they'll talk to the jockey, they'll hopefully review the race with their vets. if there is a problem, the vets know the places to go to, and they'll check those off. So slowly but surely, I think if we do this and if we keep doing it, and we're going to get the universities, because Professor Bailey has already volunteered to do this, to teach the vets at the track. We now have to educate them, just like we all learned about ultrasound back in the 80s. We didn't have ultrasound machines in the 70s. And they all showed up and we all had to learn how to work with them. Well, it'll be the same with this. The next generation of racetrack veterinarian is going to have to be knowledgeable about data from sensors. We're going to have to teach them how to read, these signals. It's fairly straightforward. They'll catch on quick. But I could see that then being an integral part of training and caring for, at a veterinary level, horses at the racetrack, and catching these things really early, because then they're all going to have to start learning how to fix, how to cure these very, very early, let's call them athletic ailments, that subsequently 10, 12 weeks later lead to unsoundness, which 10 weeks after that leads to a fatality. But if we can send that whole thing back to the very, very, very first instant that some little muscle takes a tweak or some little ligament gets pulled, if we can get the whole industry back there working, then so many of our problems go away. Fixing these fatalities is just a coincidental event. What will really happen when we do it properly is the horses will stay sound. We'll keep them sound. We'll keep them sound for longer. We'll have racetracks full of 7-year-olds and 8-year-olds, because we'll be able to catch them before something goes wrong. So the whole thing is revolutionary if we can just get it going, and by bringing the right kind of data to the trainers and educate the vets as best we can. And if we can do it from there, from the ground up, I think the industry is in a really good place. I think we can fix all this stuff.
Well, Dave, now more than ever, that would be a fantastic thing. You mentioned veterinarians. I don't think we've mentioned this yet. I mean, you are Dr. David Lambert. You are a longtime veterinarian yourself in the UK and the United States. How has your veterinary background influenced your passion for this particular project?
That's interesting. Well, certainly I've ended up where I am through my veterinary education. That got me the opportunity to be in this spot. My veterinary education gave me some of the background knowledge which I was going to need. But I think the real passion has just come from being around the horses, to be honest. I rode out all the time, when I was a vet up in New Jersey, Belmont, Monmouth, all over. I was fortunate enough to have an amateur license. So I rode a few races and rode over jumps. I had a trainer's license for a while. Wasn't very good at that. But I was down in the trenches with everybody. And so the race business gets in your blood, doesn't it? And, like to be on a young 3-year-old at 6:00 in the morning, galloping around Belmont as the sun comes up, that's kind of where your passion comes from, trying to save that. I've had a couple of falls. I remember one I had where fingers and thumbs were tingling, and you're lying there on the ground and you don't know quite what's happened. So it ends up giving you a certain feeling and understanding, empathy for the jockeys. Because, we talk about horses all the time, and that's absolutely great. But for every horse that goes down, there's a jockey goes with him. And some family could be, devastated. So, in the back of my mind, as much as we talk about jockeys as horses, my mind is firmly on the jockeys. I think there's as much motivation from that. If we can save a jockey from getting paralyzed, that's a big deal. So, the being a vet, yeah, it's important. It got me to the spot. It got me where I could understand bone and understand the pathology, and and I could start putting the physiology together of how one horse can beat another and all that kind of stuff that I've done for 40 years. But it's the entire package, just everything to do with the horses, the pleasure of being around them, the people that you meet, all of it. Just, that's the passion, and that's what we have to save. That's what we got to fix this.
Well, Dave, I could sit here for another hour. I'm pretty sure we could just have a 3-hour podcast here. I just got a couple of questions and then we'll wrap it. First off, you're known as the heart doctor. You are the heart maestro. What is the best heart you've ever measured? Which horse was it? The second off is, why do you go and measure horses' hearts at night? Because I'm sure you'll be here till midnight measuring hearts because you're at Keeneland right now. And the third, what has the spleen got to do with it for those people that don't know? So if you could just put a brief synopsis in, that would be great.
We're trying to cut this short, are we, Zoe? Hearts were a long time ago. Started that in the late 70s. We have many more tests now. You'd be fascinated. Feel free, call me anytime. If you saw what we do now, there's 7 or 8 different systems that we're able to assess to determine whether a horse is going to be any good or not. But here's one just for a bit of interest, right? The best hearts are not big. They're not. The best hearts are average, right? So think about this one. I'll just be real quick, right? So a grade 1 winner is one in about every 300 horses to run, right? So if you say let's say there were 5 different things that made a racehorse, just kind of go with the flow for the argument to get the point. So if item number 1 existed 1 in 3, so that's pretty common, right? If the second point was 1 in 3, that means 1 and 9 have both. And if the third one was 1 in 3, that's 1 in 27, right? Have all of them. And then the next 1 in 3, that's 1 in roughly 100, right? I've got all 4 of them. And if you wanted to get all 5 of these variables, if that's 1 in 3, you've got 1 in 300, right? So the actual fact that there's only one grade 1 winner in every 300 to run, by definition means that each of the characteristics are average. The grade 1 horses are not outstanding. They're not outliers generally. They're average everywhere. And that's a bit of a mind blower, right? Because we think these things are superstars and we look up to them, that they're in some way magnificent, but they're not. They're average everywhere. Their bones, their spleens, their hearts, the elasticity, all the different things that we look at. Average, gun runner. That's tap it. There's 2. And when they're perfect, when they're average everywhere, they fit any mare that comes through the door, just like Tappet does and just like Gunrunner does. Any mare that comes in gets moved up because you're trying to drive everything back to average, right? Because average is the answer, right? So you're bringing in all these different big mares, little mares, fast mares, slow mares, drag them back to average. And Gunrunner is so good at that. He's so prepotent for that. And then working with Mr. Winchell, he's directed the right mares to this thing. And you get Steve, a great trainer, looking after all of these things. And all of a sudden, Gunrunner does things that no stallion in history has ever done before, because all the science was pulled together, all the traditional horsemanship was pulled together, and that's the answer. And the answer's average. So that's just to be provocative. I'll leave the rest.
Wow. Well, Dr. Lambert, very interesting stuff. And it's nice to know that you and others are working so hard to make racing safer, because that is the number 1 priority for this sport. Dr. David Lambert, the founder of StrideSAFE USA and this week's Green Group Guest of the Week. Thanks so much for joining us.
Great, guys. Thank you very much indeed for having me on.
That's this week's